Hey everyone, welcome back to the show. Today we're going to be diving into something, something that I think a lot of people struggle with, and that's the feeling of loneliness.
Definitely a universal experience.
Yeah, and we're coming at this from uh, a Christian perspective, so we're looking at this through the lens of faith,
Right.
and we're using a podcast episode called "How Can Christians Understand and Overcome Loneliness"
Yeah.
as our source material.
A great episode, I think.
Yeah, it's got some really good stuff in there. And for our listeners out there who are looking for that kind of guidance, I think this is going to be a really helpful deep dive.
I think so.
So
Yeah.
one of the things that the episode points out right off the bat is that there are lots of different things that can trigger loneliness.
Yeah.
It's not always the same for everyone. Sometimes it's tough situations.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's, you're just emotionally drained.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes it can even be doubts creeping into your faith.
Absolutely. And I think what's fascinating is that understanding the specific cause of your loneliness is crucial for actually overcoming it. It's not a one-size-fits-all problem.
Right. You wouldn't treat a headache
Right.
the same way you'd treat a sprained ankle.
Yeah.
It's kind of like that with loneliness.
Exactly.
It's got different roots.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the podcast actually highlights how some Christians isolate themselves after experiencing persecution or questioning their beliefs.
That makes sense. It's like a self-protection mechanism.
That's
You're hurting, so you withdraw.
Right.
But the podcast also warns that this isolation can actually be a tool
It can.
that's used to weaken our faith.
A tool of the enemy.
Yeah, they use that phrase, the enemy.
Yeah.
Which I think for those who aren't familiar with the term, it's referring to kind of like evil or, spiritual forces working against us.
Exactly.
So it's interesting how they connect isolation to this idea of self-sufficiency. Yeah.
This belief that we can handle it all on our own. We don't need anybody, not even God. And that's where things get really tricky.
It's almost like saying, hey, God, I got this, thanks, but no thanks.
Yeah.
Okay.
That's a great way to put it. It really contradicts the core message of Christianity, humility and reliance on God's grace.
And that's where the podcast brings in this powerful truth. God's promise to never leave or forsake us.
Absolutely. It even references Hebrews 13.5, where it says, I will never leave you nor forsake you.
Now, we may have heard that passage before.
Right.
But how deeply do we believe it?
That's the question.
It's one thing to know it up here.
Yeah.
But it's another to really let it sink in.
Absolutely. It's about internalizing that truth, letting it change how you experience loneliness.
Yeah, because if you truly believe that even when you feel alone, God is actually with you, it changes everything.
Yeah.
Doesn't it?
It does. It changes the whole experience of loneliness. It's no longer this gaping void. There's a presence, a support that shifts everything.
It's that shift from head knowledge to heart knowledge.
Right.
So we're starting to see the problem. We're reminded of God's presence. But how do we actually overcome loneliness? How do we move from understanding to action?
Well, the podcast lays out some practical steps.
Oh, good. I was hoping they would get into that.
Yeah, it starts with acknowledging those feelings of loneliness. Don't try to bury them or pretend they're not there.
Right, because shoving them down just makes them stronger in the dark.
Exactly. Bring them into the light, acknowledge them, and then the podcast suggests actively cultivating intimacy with God.
Okay, so not just knowing about him, but really experiencing his presence.
Right.
That makes sense. But what does cultivating intimacy with God actually look like in everyday life?
That's a great question. And that's what we'll explore next. We'll unpack practical ways to connect with God on a deeper level, drawing from the wisdom of this podcast and beyond.
All right, so we're going to get really practical. I think our listeners are ready for that.
I think so too.
So stay tuned. We'll be right back after a quick break. Okay, so we're talking about cultivating intimacy with God as like a way to combat loneliness. But what does that actually look like, in practice?
It's a great question. And the podcast actually gets pretty practical here, Think about how you deepen any relationship with someone you love.
Right.
You spend time with them. You talk to them.
You listen to them.
You listen to them. Exactly. It's the same principle with God.
So things like prayer and reading the Bible.
Exactly. Those are key pillars.
Okay.
Setting aside dedicated time for prayer. Whether it's structured or spontaneous, it's like having a conversation with God.
Yeah.
And reading the Bible, studying it, meditating on it. It's like listening to God's heart.
I can see how that would make a difference over time.
Yeah.
And it seems like those practices kind of naturally lead to that shift that the podcast talks about.
Oh, absolutely.
The shifting our focus away from ourselves.
Yeah, when we're constantly dwelling on our own problems and feelings, it's like staring into a mirror all day. It distorts our perspective.
Yeah.
But when we turn our attention outward toward God and toward others, it's like opening a window and letting fresh air in.
And the podcast actually has this great quote. It says, when you feel alone, it's an invitation to draw closer to God.
I love that.
Isn't that good?
It's a beautiful reframing.
Yeah, it's not denying the loneliness,
Yeah.
but it's seeing it as a doorway to something deeper.
Exactly. And speaking of reframing, the podcast also talks about the power of God's love,
Okay.
specifically referencing Romans 8.3839, which says nothing can separate us from his love. But how does knowing we're loved actually help with feeling alone?
Right. That's what I was wondering. It's a beautiful sentiment, but how does it actually play out?
Yeah. Well, think back to what we discussed earlier about self-sufficiency being a trap. Embracing God's love is like the key that unlocks that trap.
Okay.
It reminds us that we are inherently worthy of love. We're not defined by our loneliness or our circumstances.
Yeah.
And that's a powerful antidote to the feeling of being unwanted or unseen.
It's that feeling of being completely known and loved.
Yes.
Even in our messiness.
Even in our messiness.
Yeah.
And that sense of connection is vital for combating loneliness.
Yeah.
You know, it's that assurance that even when we feel isolated from others, we're still tethered to something bigger, to a love that never fails.
So it's not just about our connection with God, right?
Right.
The podcast also talks about the importance of
human connection.
Of being part of a community.
Yeah.
It actually uses Ecclesiastes 4.910 as an example.
Okay.
Which talks about how two are better than one. It's this beautiful image of mutual support, of having someone to lean on when you're struggling.
Which makes a lot of sense, practically speaking.
Yeah.
We're wired for connection, you know?
Absolutely.
We need people to share our burdens with, to celebrate with, to just do life with.
And that's where the church or any supportive community really comes in.
Yeah.
It's a place where you can be known and loved for who you are, you know? Where you can find encouragement and practical help. So it sounds like we're talking about kind of a two-pronged approach here.
Yeah.
Deepening our connection with God and intentionally seeking out those supportive relationships.
Exactly. It's not either. It's both hand.
It's not about retreating into ourselves or trying to fix it all on our own. It's about engaging in those life-giving relationships.
I love that.
That can really sustain us.
It's beautiful. And that's what we'll explore further as we move into the final part of our deep dive.
It feels like we've really been given a roadmap here.
We have.
You know, for navigating loneliness from this Christian perspective.
Yeah.
And it's not just like, you know, describing the problem. It's actually giving us tools to help us move towards healing and connection.
It's a powerful shift from feeling helpless to feeling empowered, you know? We're reminded that even though this is a universal experience, we're not alone in facing it.
Yeah, and we have these incredible resources available to us.
Absolutely.
Through our faith.
Like God's constant presence.
Yes.
His unconditional love. And the support of community. It's a pretty incredible support system.
It really is.
When you think about it.
And the podcast really emphasizes that tapping into these resources is an active choice.
Oh, yeah.
It's not passive.
Yeah.
You know, it's about intentionally cultivating that relationship with God, seeking out those supportive relationships, and choosing to embrace the truth that we're loved and valued.
It's almost like we're invited to shift our perspective from what's wrong with me to who can I connect with.
I love that. It's so much more empowering and hopeful.
Yeah.
It's about recognizing that we're not broken or deficient. We're wired for connection.
And that those connections can be found both vertically with God and horizontally with other people.
Absolutely. And the podcast ends on this really thought-provoking question.
Okay.
You know, we've talked about God's presence as a comfort in loneliness.
Right.
But what if loneliness itself could be an invitation to deepen our relationship with God? That's interesting. So it's like maybe those moments of feeling alone are actually opportunity to lean in even more.
Exactly.
To seek his presence more intentionally.
It might sound counterintuitive.
Yeah.
But sometimes it's in those moments of emptiness that we're most open.
Wow.
To experiencing God's presence and his love.
It's like you're turning what feels like a negative experience into this catalyst for spiritual growth.
Yeah. It's beautiful.
I hope this deep dive has given you some solid starting points for dealing with loneliness. You know, we've unpacked the roots of the problem. We've explored the dangers of isolation.
Mm.
And most importantly, we've discovered those powerful antidotes through God's love
Right.
and the supportive community. So keep exploring, keep connecting. And remember, you are never truly alone.